As Raul Castro steps down as head of Cuba's ruling Communist Party, hopes are high for a policy reset with the Biden administration. The island is reeling from a severe economic crisis due to crippling US sanctions and the coronavirus pandemic. Floyd Cush reports.
A rousing welcome for the first US president to visit Havana in 88 years. Barack Obama's 2016 trip to Cuba stirred hopes of a new era of prosperity, free of crippling American sanctions.
During Obama's visit, and while Obama was president, really for us, not just for me, but for all Cubans, there was a great improvement because cruise ships were coming. There was a really good amount of tourism. A lot of Americans were coming.
But the relaxed approach was not to last. Donald Trump took office less than a year later and ended cruises to Havana, limited flights, and discouraged foreign investment.
I am canceling the last administration's completely one-sided deal with Cuba.
In a second blow to Cuba, the COVID-19 pandemic emptied tourist towns. The downturn forced many people employed in the tourism sector back to the land. The economy is now suffering its worst crisis since the breakup of its former benefactor, the Soviet Union.
I went from driving tourists around on a horse-drawn carriage to walking next to a forge. Now this is hard work.
With new leadership in Washington and Havana comes new hope for Cubans. During his campaign, President Joe Biden promised to wind back Trump policies, a tantalizing proposition for entrepreneurs.
I hope the Biden administration will take into account what small businesses have done and the growth of Cuba's private sector.
But it may be some time until the streets are buzzing with tourists again.
A Cuba policy shift is not currently among President Biden's top priorities, but we are committed to making human rights a core pillar of our U.S. policy.
It's disappointing news for Cubans who survived decades of Cold War hostility. But as the post-Castro era begins, it's hoped new leader Miguel Diaz-Canel will push ahead with sweeping reforms and persuade the US to change its tune. Floyd Cush, TRT World.
Let's get more on this now with Remi Piet in Miami. He's a senior partner at the emerging markets consultancy Embellie Advisory, who specialises in the Americas. Welcome back to the program, Remi. Now, can we reflect on one of President Raul Castro's major legacies, and that's the reforms that he announced in 2011. He announced a raft of measures aimed at bringing the notoriously socialist Cuba into a more market-friendly environment, including allowing Cubans to set up small businesses, which was groundbreaking at the time. So a decade on, can you tell us what sort of progress is being made in terms of opening up Cuba's economy?
Yes, thank you, Oscar, for having me. I mean, you actually make a great point of mentioning the centrality of this change in 2011 and the decision to move away from an only structure around the Communist Party economic system and try to facilitate the creation of a small private enterprise, especially in the tourism sector. Now, all those reforms from 2011 have been somewhat stalled for a series of reasons. And when you actually study closely Cuba, there's obviously a series of similarities between and correlation between the policies from the U.S. in terms of embargo, but also the capacity of the country to develop key sectors such as the tourism sector, and those two elements have made it that last few years have been extremely complicated for Cuba. I mean, the pandemic has hit extremely hard the tourism sector, and the Trump administration has rolled back on all the reforms that the Obama administration had done previously. So the situation, the economic situation, has been very dire over the last few years in Cuba. There's a sound of hope, obviously, with the arrival of the Biden administration, with also potentially the end of the pandemics, the fact that Cuba has been able also to showcase a few key success, especially on the pandemics front, with the high level of the health sector relatively to other countries with the same development level, and the capacity to manufacture eventually their own vaccine. So there's a series of good, interesting sectors ready to pick up, but all this is very much in line obviously with the position from the Biden administration, with the evolution of the pandemics, and specifically when you're talking about those reforms, the few words from the Biden administration saying that they will be very attentive to issues of human rights will mean that we'll probably have maybe a less naive and more efficient policies from the U.S. on making sure that these reforms are continued after stepping down of the Castro family and with Miguel Diaz-Canel in charge.
And as you pointed out, Cuba's, I guess, fortunes has really been tied to the whims of the US administration at the time. As we heard in Floyd's story there, things were looking up when Obama agreed to reset relations, to become more friendly with Cuba, but then in 2016, obviously, we saw Donald Trump come into power and reverse all that. Do you expect the Biden administration to revert back to some of the Obama-era policies that are more friendly towards Cuba?
So obviously, now President Joe Biden was vice president during the Obama administration. There's obviously a similarity of thoughts with the previous Democrat administration in Washington. In doing his presidential campaign, also Joe Biden has confirmed that he will probably not as strongly and not as swiftly change the policies towards Cuba, especially in terms of remittances from especially the diaspora in Florida and other states in the U.S. capacity to send more money to Cuba, and also a series of capacity for Americans to travel to Cuba. That would be obviously very, very important for the tourism sector. So we will see an evolution and potentially a very favorable economic evolution for Cuba. But the key question is not only on the American position or the tourism sector. There's a series of issues in Cuba in terms of other sectors. Cuba imports 2/3 of its food, for example, in a country that could be producing, and that's because of the fact that there's very low levels of equipment. There's an embargo that prevents Cuba from importing a series of machineries and maybe build its industry. So that's also on this element of the moving away from the embargo, maybe the releasing of a series of sanctions that will allow then the Cuban economy to take off like it was doing so before the arrival of the Trump administration. And so we will see this over the next few years. But as the representative of the White House said very clearly, this is not a priority right now on the Biden agenda. There will be some evolutions behind closed doors and kind of, as I said, key reforms on remittances and others. But obviously you will not see Joe Biden travel to Cuba this year like the historic travel visit from President Obama. It will be a much more, let's say, steady, gradual change, and also putting in line the making sure that there are a series of reforms in terms of participation and political discourse.
Okay, Remi Piet from Embellie Advisory in Miami. Thank you again for joining us on the program.